Welcome to Lecture 9, covering Chapter 22. It's going to consist of the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. If you recall, this is one of the 10 principles of macroeconomics that we first discussed in Chapter 1, that a society faces a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Inflation and unemployment are the two most closely watched indicators of economic performance when you want to look at a country. There's usually three things that you want to look at. It's usually real GDP, inflation, and unemployment. Before, we studied monetary and fiscal policy, where we found that policymakers could expand aggregate demand and move the economy up along the short-run aggregate supply curve, at which point output expands, it goes above its natural rate, and reduces unemployment for a while, but at a cost of a rapidly rising price level, or inflation. If policymakers contract aggregate demand and move the economy down the short-run aggregate supply, they can reduce inflation, but at a cost of temporarily lowering output and a higher unemployment rate. Today, we're going to review this relationship more closely, and we're going to cover the Phillips curve. The most important macroeconomic relationship is demonstrated by the Phillips curve. We're going to go over the origin. In 1958, A.W. Phillips became famous for publishing his paper, The Relationship Between Unemployment and the Rate of Change of Money Wages in the United Kingdom from 1861 to 1957. In this, Phillips showed a negative correlation between the rate of unemployment and the rate of inflation. The papers that followed looked for this correlation in other countries, not just the United Kingdom. They found the same results and backed this relationship. They also dubbed this relationship, or in this curve, the Phillips curve. Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow were two people who published their own paper and found the same result, that the Phillips curve was a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. This influenced policymakers, both monetary and fiscal policymakers, that they could have a long-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation. However, this may not be the case, but we will further go into that a bit later. This is an example of the Phillips curves. This graph shows a negative relationship. It's downward sloping between inflation and unemployment. If you want low unemployment, so you want to be closer to this end of the x-axis, you have to accept high rates of inflation, and vice versa. If you want low rates of inflation, you need high rates of unemployment. The Phillips curve was so influential because the relationship was not fully appreciated by economists before this, and presented policymakers with a menu of options to choose from. Do they want to be towards the northwest, up here, with high inflation but low unemployment, or would they rather be closer to the southeast with low inflation but higher unemployment? Of course, the policymaker would prefer to be in the southwest corner with low inflation and low unemployment. This would be ideal, but they have to be along this line. For now, anyways. In the future, we might find a way where maybe we can shift this curve. If we shift it to the left, down here, we may see that we would have the same Phillips curve. If you just shift it down, would be for all points of inflation a lower unemployment rate. So the Phillips curve is a combination of inflation and unemployment rates that arise in the short run. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply fits in with the Phillips curve well. The aggregate demand and the aggregate supply provide an easy explanation for the outcomes described by the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve shows the combination of inflation and unemployment that arise in the short run as shifts from the AD curve that moves the economy along the short-run aggregate supply curve. So if we look at figure 2 here, we can let's imagine we are at point A and we increase aggregate demand. We go to point B. On the Phillips curve on the right side, we'll be here at this point and we'll move to point B. So the Phillips curve demonstrates points where the aggregate demand and the short-run aggregate supply intersect. We can see that the AD and the AS, we have two possibilities, right? We have low aggregate demand or high aggregate demand. If it's high aggregate demand, we're at point B, and if it's low aggregate demand, we'll be at point A. If you recall our traditional graph, point B would be an expansion. It's higher aggregate demand than we expected or from where we were. So the AD shifts to the right, which means we are going to have higher output and a higher price level. And if there's a higher output, that's going to be lower unemployment. So if we look at point B on the Phillips curve, we have a lower unemployment, higher price level, and from our ADAS model, we have a higher output. So the Phillips curve works very nicely with the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. With a low demand, we are at a point with a lower output. So our output is lower than at point B. We'll be at 15,000 instead of 6,000, 16,000. We can set these points on the Phillips curve and construct the line and the points on the line. Because monetary and fiscal policy can shift the aggregate demand curve, they can move along the lines of the Phillips curve. They can choose to be at point A or point B or any of the points in between. Increases in the money supply or increases in the government spending, cuts in taxes, they will all expand the aggregate demand and move the economy to a point on the Phillips curve with a higher inflation and lower unemployment. So an increase in the money supply, increase in government spending, or cut in taxes is going to move from point A to point B, where we have higher inflation and lower unemployment. And vice versa is true. The opposite is true. If you reduce the money supply, if you decrease government spending, or if you increase taxes, we'll move from point B to point A with higher unemployment and a lower inflation rate. As you can see, the Phillips curve will offer options of inflation and unemployment that policymakers could choose from. So for just a quick review, the AD, the aggregate demand, shifts along the short-run aggregate supply, and the combinations where they intersect of inflation and unemployment gives us our Phillips curve. What does a Phillips curve shifting mean then? For that, we are going to look at the roles of expectations. You may recall from previous discussions of the short-run aggregate supply that expectations have a big role to play when shifting the short-run aggregate supply. And that same idea is going to come into play with the Phillips curve. Milton Friedman wrote a paper titled The Role of Monetary Policy. As he was a champion of monetary policy, he detailed what monetary policy could do and what it could not do. He argued that monetary policy could not, other than for a short time, lower unemployment by raising inflation, which is countering this idea of the Phillips curve. Edmund Phelps reached the same conclusion, citing that no long-run trade-off existed between inflation and unemployment. They based these conclusions on the classical assumptions. Friedman argued that the central bank, or the Fed, could not affect real variables, but only nominal variables. I hope this sounds familiar. He drew a graph that he could draw his conclusions from. And he suggested that the Phillips curve in the long run would be vertical, just like the long run aggregate supply. And that if they increase the money supply, the unemployment doesn't change. And in the long run, it remains at the natural rate of unemployment. We've already discussed this idea in detail, right? It's the exact same idea that the classical economists believed in. It's describing monetary neutrality. If I increase the money supply, real output doesn't change. It's just the prices that increased. In this case, if we increase the money supply, the unemployment doesn't change. It's just the inflation that changes. Since we have already discussed this, I won't go into too much detail all over again. The same principles remain. An increase in the money supply, just to review, increases AD, the aggregate demand, but the long run aggregate supply is vertical. So it's going to arrive at a point where the price level is higher and the output is the same. In other words, it's just going to be inflation. We'll look at figure 4. This is the Phillips curve. Oh, this is figure 3. We'll look at figure 3 with the Phillips curve being vertical. As you can see, whether we are at low inflation or high inflation, the natural rate of unemployment is constant. This is what Milton Friedman suggested. The long-run Phillips curve, expression of the classical idea of monetary neutrality. This is what I was just discussing. So, figure 4 shows the relationship between the money supply shifting and the Phillips curve. We can see that if we increase the money supply, right, we're going to shift from AD, the blue line, to AD2, the red line. Prices rise, which is inflation, and on the Phillips curve, you can see inflation, but unemployment is the same, and natural level of output is the same. The reason I mention this, and the key takeaway, is that monetary policy is ineffective at tackling long-run unemployment. Recall, the natural rate of unemployment is not necessarily the desired level of unemployment. It is the level of unemployment that is typically seen. Let's take an example. If the minimum wage is set above the equilibrium wage, remember it's going to create structural unemployment. The quantity supplied of labor is greater than the quantity demanded, which means that there is unemployment. And in this case, it's going to be structural unemployment. The increase in the minimum wage increased the natural rate of unemployment because it created structural unemployment, even if we would prefer the equilibrium level of unemployment, which would be a lower rate of unemployment. Although monetary policy cannot affect natural rate of unemployment, other policies can. Like I just mentioned, how the minimum wage could influence the natural rate. If policy passes that reduces the natural rate of unemployment, the Phillips curve is going to shift downward or towards the left. Because unemployment is lower, meaning more workers are working, then that means the output's going to be higher. The economy can enjoy higher output and lower unemployment for any given rate of unemployment. So if we look at here, if you can imagine a line right over here, if we just shift the long run curve over here, even if AD shifted, right, we might have the same inflation rates as before. We could just draw a line straight across, still at B, still at A, so the inflation rates are the same, but our level of unemployment would be much lower. So policy that can reduce the natural rate of unemployment is good. That's what we would want. Well, the paper that Phillips published covered the period from 1861 to 1957 and found a negative relationship and not a vertical relationship. How come the long-run theoretical differs so much from the evidence presented by Milton Friedman? Well, Friedman and Phelps were aware that this was contradictory and presented a reconciliation of ideas. They used the same logic as the sticky wage theory. They presented expected inflation, where the sticky wage theory was based off the expected prices, which is what they based their wages off, right? If they expected prices to be high, then they would argue for a higher wage. In this, we're going to have the expected inflation, or the expectation of the change in price level. You could just the expected inflation rate is the best way to think of this. The expected price level affects the short-run aggregate supply since it changes a nominal variable. In the short run, the Fed takes it as predetermined, and thus the short-run aggregate supply is already determined. The line is already made. When the money supply changes, the AD shifts and moves along the short-run aggregate supply. In the short run, therefore, monetary changes lead to unexpected fluctuations in output, prices, unemployment, and inflation. In this way, Friedman and Phelps explained the downward sloping Phillips curve that Phillips, Samuelson, and Solow documented. By suddenly changing monetary policy, the Fed creates unexpected inflation, but this only lasts in the short run. So this is how they found the Phillips curve being a negative relationship in the long run was basically a series of short-run fluctuations between inflation and unemployment. But in the long run, they suggested it was different. They wanted to say that the Phillips curve was vertical in the long run, and basically they wanted the classical assumptions to hold. This equation, where the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment minus this alpha, this A, parentheses, actual inflation minus expected inflation, where A is just a parameter dictating how much this affects the unemployment rate. It's very similar to the short-run aggregate supply equation that was discussed previously. It's best seen in a graph. The short-run Phillips curve intersects the long-run Phillips curve at exactly the expected inflation rate. So here, this would be the short-run Phillips curve, the sloped one, the long-run Phillips curve. This, at point A, if we're at point A, would be the expected rate of inflation, because that's where the two lines intersect. Well, monetary policy can increase the amount of money. So when you increase the money supply, we're going to have an unexpected inflation rate. Remember that when government prints too much money, we have inflation. So the Fed increases the money supply, and we're going to move from A to B because now we have this new high rate of inflation. Once we're at B, people are going to adjust their expectations, and we are going to move the short-run Phillips curve. We're going to shift it to the right and arrive at point C, at which case our natural rate of unemployment remains the same, and our inflation rate is higher than before. There was temporary reduction in unemployment, but again, that was only in the short run. In the long run, we ended up at the same place we were before. Friedman claimed that if policymakers tried to take advantage of the Phillips curve, they will only reduce unemployment temporarily. He called this his natural rate hypothesis, that unemployment will eventually return to its normal/natural rate. This got economists really excited. They started looking at the United States data, and this data seemed to demonstrate the Phillips curve perfectly. At the time, many economists thought it was ridiculous that all reliable Phillips curve would shift, like Milton Friedman was suggesting. They wanted to find out what the true relationship was. Luckily, some policymakers inadvertently made an experiment to test it. It did, in fact, shift. Beginning in the late 1960s, there was a continually expanding AD for goods and services, aggregate demand. This was a result of partly the Vietnam War increasing fiscal spending, and partly increasing monetary policy. The United States had continual aggregate demand shifts. But as Friedman and Phelps predicted, unemployment did not stay low. At first, the relationship seemed to be consistent with the Phillips curve, that the expansion of AD decreased unemployment, but figure 7, which we're going to look at in a second, which is here, figure 7, shows by the 1970, the relationship broke down. So we start at 1961, and I know it kind of goes right to left, but that's the reason why is the axes are built the way that they are. We start in 1961, then we go to 1962 with increase in AD, so unemployment decreases, inflation seems to rise maybe a little bit, then we keep getting lower unemployment, and then we keep getting high inflation rates. So this is figure 6, which is demonstrating the Phillips curve in the 1960s. That was demonstrated in the United States, but we want to look at figure 7. So we start in 1961. Again, we move over. It's the same thing that we saw before. It looks like the Phillips curve perfectly, right? The increase in AD was lowering the unemployment and increasing inflation rate, but then all of a sudden it kind of seemed to jump over to in 1971 or 1970 we had the same rate, 5% unemployment, our inflation rate was 5%, and then we had more increases in in aggregate demand. We kept shifting AD over to 1971, and unemployment actually rose where inflation stayed the same. 1972, inflation decreased, but unemployment was roughly still hovering around 5-6%. And then in 1973, it was almost at the same place at 1970. So you can see that the expectations, maybe around 1970 to 1973, adjusted so that the unemployment would no longer decrease with increases in AD. Well, Friedman is right. This discussion is settled. But, I mean, there might be other explanations, right? In fact, while the experience convinced many economists that the shifts were caused by expectations, there was a whole section of economists that turned its attention to a different source that could explain the Phillips curve shifts. Shocks to the aggregate supply, or supply shocks. In the 1970s, a group in the Middle East was formed called OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It included Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq. This circle of oil producers began to exert their joint market power as a cartel in the world oil market. And the goal was to increase the members' profit. So they all wanted to increase their own profit by reducing the amount of oil that they were supplying in the world market. By reducing the amount of oil they produced, it caused the world price of oil to double because it became more scarce. And the more scarce an item is, typically the price level increases. So there's a huge supply shift or shock to the left. And it directly affected the firm's cost of productions, and thus the prices they charge. So policymakers had to start paying more, so they increased prices. What it did is it shifted the short-run aggregate supply curve, and as a result, the Phillips curve. We're going to look at figure 8. So OPEC was created. They started reducing the amount of oil, which increased the firm's cost of production. So it lowered the output. We went from AS1 to AS2. And then at AS2, we moved from point A to point B, where inflation occurred, but output fell. So this is stagflation. inflation and an increase in unemployment, which perfectly aligns with a shift in the Phillips curve and what the Phillips curve would predict. So A shifted to B, and if we look at this, right, for all points of inflation, we have higher unemployment. For point A, we move to point B, we have a higher rate of inflation and a higher rate of unemployment. So this is unemployment here, this is inflation here, but here we have more inflation and more unemployment. So stagflation seems to align perfectly with the rightward shift of the Phillips curve. In 1979, OPEC decided to come out with round 2 of cutting the production of oil. Fed Chairman Paul Volcker declared it was time for action. Volcker, just being appointed by Jimmy Carter 2 months earlier, wanted to reduce inflation through disinflation. Do not confuse disinflation with deflation. Disinflation is the reduction of inflation. Think about driving a car. If you apply the brakes, you're going to slow down, but you're not going to stop. This is disinflation, where deflation would be going in reverse. Now, Volcker was really worried about the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. During the 70s, there was a huge increase in inflation, and he wanted to target inflation. He wanted to reduce the inflation rate. Many Americans at this point were very worried about the increases in prices because OPEC had, for the second time that decade, created a supply shock that shifted the short-run average supply to the left. And if you recall from previous lectures, I mentioned that prices doubled in the decade of the 1970s. So in order for Volcker to target inflation, he needed to do contractionary monetary policy, which would have lower inflation rates but higher unemployment. And he was scared because this would look tremendously bad and he would also be putting people out of work. This is where the sacrifice ratio is going to come into play. The sacrifice ratio is the trade-off between output and inflation. It is calculated by the annual output lost in the process of reducing inflation by 1%. An average estimate of this ratio is 5. For every 1% inflation reduced, we're going to suffer a 5% loss in output. If there's a 5% loss in output, that means there's going to be unemployment. Just think of the short, or the, if you're thinking about the AD or AS model, think about AD shifting to the left, or even short-run average supply shifting to the left. Either one, you'll see that there is unemployment being caused. Now, remember that the sacrifice ratio is based in expectations of inflation, because that's what the Phillips curve was suggested by Milton Friedman. He was like, there's the expectations of inflation, this is going to play a role. Conventionally, people would respond to the change in monetary policy and eventually adjust their expectations. But a new idea came about. The policy idea came from rational expectations, as we're going to call it. People use all available information from the government to decide on their beliefs or their expectations. In this way, it may be possible to reduce the negative effects caused from expectations, in the best case, to 0. But in most cases, it would never be 0. If the government made a credible commitment to a policy of low inflation, people would be rational enough to lower their expectations of inflation immediately. The short-run Phillips curve would shift downward, and the economy could then have a lower inflation rate without the temporary cost of high unemployment. Well, now we have these two competing ideas, right? Who was right? Let's look at figure 11. So we started from 1979 and we kind of followed this. We went from 1980 to 1981, 82. So we kind of started a high inflation rate, and then all of a sudden there's a huge drop in inflation rate, but unemployment was steadily increasing, but it kind of seemed constant, and then unemployment seemed to drop and inflation rate kind of dropped again. And by 1987, we were at like 3% inflation rate over here and maybe 6% unemployment rate. So even though our unemployment rate stayed the same from through the 8 years, unemployment dropped, even though unemployment stayed the same at 6%, inflation dropped from 8% all the way down to around 3%. As you can see, Volcker succeeded in reducing inflation, but the unemployment rate was high, right? We went from here to here, it reached almost 10%. The reduction in inflation was solely through monetary policy at this time, as fiscal policy was running a budget deficit and expanding AD, which tends to do the opposite of decreasing inflation, or tends to increase inflation. So his monetary policy, Volcker's, was doing almost double work because it had to beat out that fiscal policy and also reduce the already high inflation rates. So it seems like the rational expectation people didn't really work because Volcker was very clear on his goals. He said right when he started that he was going to tackle inflation rate no matter the cost. So it would seem that maybe the rational expectation people were not right. It seems they were wrong. But let's not toss out this idea quite yet. The sacrifice ratio at the time would predicted that the costs of this decrease in inflation would have been much worse. But perhaps Volcker's tough attitude on inflation had some effect on expectations, suggesting that the sacrifice ratio wasn't as strong because Volcker changed the expectations of the people. Secondly, it's also possible that not everybody believed Volcker's stance on inflation was legitimate. In fact, many did not even believe that he would try to lower inflation. Like, he said he would, but then again, it would cause high unemployment, so then he wouldn't actually go through with it. So I'm going to hold my expectations where they are, and I don't think he's going to do it. Meaning that, which caused the effect of higher unemployment because they didn't change their expectations. Meaning they had not rationally adjusted their expectations. Which is a defense of the rational expectations idea. Now, most economists think that the rational expectations were wrong and that this idea doesn't actually hold true because they think the trade-off will happen regardless. Even if you tell people that you're going to target inflation, doesn't mean that they will adjust their expectations, and it's not going to work itself out like that. However, I am going to discuss an example later down the line where possibly expectations have actually changed based off of a commitment to a policy and people responded accordingly. But first, let's talk about the Greenspan era. He was elected chair in 1987, and this period was surprisingly peaceful for the economy. The Fed and the government were very careful not to repeat the mistakes in the 60s. Series of positive supply shocks from OPEC arguing amongst themselves helped. And in the 90s, we experienced huge technological booms, like the computers and phones, and the economy was doing extremely well. However, in 2001, we did have a recession for the first time in a decade. But quick monetary and fiscal policy helped curb the recession, and unemployment was close to most estimates of what the natural rate of unemployment was by 2005. So it recovered relatively quickly. Here you can see the inflation and unemployment rate during the Greenspan eras. We can start at 1984, 85, 86. It gets kind of tangled and goes up in a circle, and it looks quite hectic. A lot of this has to do with the supply shocks, the booms, and also, of course, the government or fiscal and monetary policy during the times. But that is to say, inflation was relatively stable during this period. While unemployment may have fluctuated from 4 to almost 8% in 1992, it looks like, inflation was below 4% in all these years. So you could see that there was good control of inflation by Greenspan. The next period would be from 2005 to now. Ben Bernanke, or Bernanke, I hope I'm saying it right, was in charge of the Fed. And as you guys know, in the late 2000s, from 2007, 2008, around there, we had the Great Recession. And during this period, expected inflation remained at 2%. So this is what I was talking about earlier, which kept the Phillips curve relatively stable. An explanation for this phenomenon is that the Fed Reserve had established a lot of credibility in its commitment to keep the inflation rate at about 2%. So in this case, the commitment of the monetary policy or the policymakers was believed, whereas Volcker may not have been believed. And they believed that inflation would not change even though we were going into a recession. And as a result, the Phillips curve reacted less to the dramaticness of the short-run events that were occurring during this period. And by 2018, unemployment was below 4% and inflation was at 2.3%, which was the highest it had been since 2007. Since then, well, at the time, I don't know about now, but the Fed was doing contractionary policy. They were trying to raise the interest rates and decrease inflation because, well, in part, they want to have higher interest rates so they have more room to play with monetary policy and avoid the liquidity trap, but also to reduce the inflation rate because it was at 2.7%, which is a little bit higher than we would have liked. That concludes the informational part of this lecture. I want to end on a quote and the idea that most economists share, the sentiment that they all have based on this idea. And it's a quote from Milton Friedman, which is, "There is always a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. There is no permanent trade-off. The temporary trade-off comes not from inflation per se, but from unanticipated inflation, which generally means from a rising rate of inflation. The widespread belief that there is a permanent trade-off is a sophisticated version of the confusion between high and rising that we all recognize in simpler forms. A rising rate of inflation may reduce unemployment, a high rate of inflation will not. But how long, you will say, is temporary? I can at most venture a personal judgment based on some examination of the historical evidence, that the initial effects of a higher and unanticipated rate of inflation last for something like 2 to 5 years." End quote. This basically is his idea that in the short run Phillips curve, there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation rate. that we all experience, we can increase monetary policy to have temporary reduction in unemployment rate, but at a cost of higher inflation rate. If we want to have a lower inflation rate, we can do contractionary monetary policy, which will increase unemployment rate. And it's what we discussed in the agri-demand, agri-supply model of how fiscal policy changes and how that will affect the unemployment rate. Now that basically concludes this lecture.